There's a rule inside palace walls that nobody writes down, but everybody knows. You do not speak about what you see. You do not react to what surprises you. You stand, you observe, you carry the weight of royal secrets the way old stone carries the weight of centuries, silently, without complaint, without expression. The men and women who guard the British monarchy are trained to be invisible, not because they are unimportant, because they are trusted with everything. James Whitmore had served the crown for 19 years. He had stood outside doors behind which history was made. He had escorted grieving relatives through back corridors no tourist ever walks. He had watched the most powerful people on earth say things they thought no one could hear, and he had carried those words with him the way you carry a stone in your shoe, always there, never mentioned. His face had become something close to marble over the years. His colleagues joked that you could set off a firework behind him, and he would not flinch. His wife said he had forgotten how to look surprised. He thought she was probably right. So when he saw it, when his eyes landed on the brooch pinned to Camilla's coat during the private reception at Windsor on that gray Tuesday in October, the fact that he registered anything at all was remarkable. But he registered it. His eyes did not widen. His posture did not shift. His hand, resting at his side in the particular way guards rest their hands, relaxed but ready, did not move. None of that. He had 19 years of practice preventing all of that. But somewhere behind his eyes, something happened. A recognition so deep and so specific that it moved through him like a cold current in warm water. There and gone. Invisible to anyone watching. Except one person was watching him. Her name was Sergeant Claire Alderton. She had been observing royal guards for 11 years. Not the way tourists observe them. Not with cameras and the breathless hope that something would happen, but with the quiet, methodical attention of someone who understood what stillness cost a person. She noticed things in people's stillness the way a doctor notices things in a patient's silence. The thing they are not saying is often the most important thing. She noticed Whitmore's eyes. She filed it away. 3 weeks earlier, in a basement archive room in the Victoria and Albert Museum, a junior curator named Sophie Reeves had been cross-referencing a catalog of royal jewelry pieces from the mid-20th century when she stopped moving entirely. Just stopped. Her pen hovered above the page. Her breathing apparently stopped too, because the researcher sitting across from her looked up and asked if she was all right. She was not exactly all right. She was looking at a photograph, a black and white photograph taken in 1953, the year of Queen Elizabeth II's coronation, at a private dinner hosted by the royal household for a small group of Commonwealth dignitaries. The kind of event that generated exactly one photograph for official records and then was largely forgotten. The photograph showed the late queen in profile, laughing at something off camera. She was wearing a brooch. Small, oval, distinctive. An antique piece with an unusual setting. A pale central stone framed by a starburst of smaller diamonds arranged not in the typical symmetrical pattern, but in a deliberately asymmetric design, like a constellation rather than a crown. Intentional, specific, unmistakable. Sophie had spent 3 years cataloging royal jewelry. She knew the major pieces the way most people know their own handwriting. The Cullinan diamonds, the girls of Great Britain and Ireland tiara, the lover's knot, the pieces that had been photographed 10,000 times, displayed in exhibitions, written about in thick academic volumes. She knew those. She also knew this one, because she had spent 6 months the previous year working on a private cataloging project for the royal collection, a project that had required her to handle pieces that had never been publicly documented. Pieces that officially did not appear in any accessible record. And this brooch had been one of them. She remembered it specifically because of the asymmetric diamond setting, which was unusual enough that she had spent almost an hour examining it under magnification, writing detailed notes in a notebook that she had then surrendered, along with everything else from that project, to the palace liaison officer at the conclusion of her work. The brooch in the 1953 photograph and the brooch she had handled in that private room were the same brooch. She was certain of this the way you're certain of things you have held in your own hands. The reason this made her stop breathing was simple. According to the records she had been given access to during that private cataloging project, the brooch did not exist anymore. That was the notation in the file. Not missing, not unaccounted for. The notation, in dry archival language, stated that the piece had been decommissioned. She had not asked what decommission meant exactly in the context of royal jewelry. She had assumed it meant something like retired from use, stored, perhaps broken down for its component stones. She had not thought about it since. There had been no reason to think about it. There was reason now. James Whitmore had first seen the brooch 22 years ago. He had been 26. A new guard, still sharp with the anxiety of wanting to prove himself worthy of the position. He had been assigned to a corridor in the private quarters of Windsor during a stay the late Queen was making in the weeks before Christmas. It was the kind of posting young guards received, quiet, low profile, nothing was expected to happen, and nothing usually did. You stood. You waited. The hours moved the way hours move in empty rooms. He had been standing outside his sitting room when the door opened and the late Queen emerged. She was not dressed for any official occasion. A simple skirt, a cardigan, the kind of quiet domestic clothes that made her look like someone's grandmother rather than the most famous woman on earth. She was carrying a small velvet pouch, the kind jewelers use, cinched at the top. She was speaking to someone behind her, a private secretary, he thought, though the person never came fully into view. Her voice was low and he caught only fragments of what she said. 2 phrases made it through clearly. He remembered them because, afterward, he turned them over in his mind the way you turn over something you have found on the ground, trying to understand what it is. She said, "It was always meant to come back." And then, a moment later, make sure she understands what it means when the time comes. Then, she walked past him, the velvet pouch in her hand. She glanced at him briefly. The late Queen always acknowledged her guards. It was a thing about her that the public never fully understood, the degree to which she was aware of every person in her vicinity. And she gave him the small nod that was her habitual acknowledgement of their presence. He gave her the crisp nod in return. She moved down the corridor. He stood and watched the wall and did not move for the next 3 hours. He thought about those words for weeks. He still thought about them sometimes. He had never told anyone, not because anyone had instructed him not to, simply because there was nothing really to tell. He had heard a fragment of a private conversation. It meant something to someone. It had nothing to do with him. He tucked it somewhere quiet and left it there the way you leave old photographs in a drawer you rarely open. Until 3 weeks ago. Until that Tuesday in October when Camilla had walked into the reception room at Windsor wearing a brooch he had never seen anyone wear except the woman who was now gone. And something in James Whitmore's chest had moved, slow and heavy, like a glacier making a centimeter of progress in a decade. He recognized it not just as a brooch, but as the brooch. The asymmetric diamond setting. The pale central stone that caught light in a way that was slightly more specific than beautiful, the way very old things often are, not decorative but meaningful, carrying the weight of whatever hands had held them before. He stood in the reception room and kept his face marble and thought about the velvet pouch and the 2 sentences and what it means when the time comes. Claire Alderton did not speak to Whitmore that night. She was not in the habit of speaking to guards about what she noticed in their faces. That was not how she operated. She observed. She cataloged. She waited to understand whether what she had seen was significant before she made any move that might disturb the situation. 19 years of professional stillness is a resource. You do not spend it carelessly. But she made a note. She was thorough in her note-making. The note read, in her small, compact handwriting, Whitmore, unusual visual response to seized jewelry. October 14th. Reception. Investigate quietly. Investigate quietly was a phrase she used often. It meant something specific in her professional vocabulary. It meant move around the edges of a thing before you move toward the center. It meant ask questions that don't sound like questions. It meant give a situation space to reveal itself before you press on it. It was going to take patience. Fortunately, patience was the thing she had most of. Camilla had not chosen the brooch herself. This was the fact that nobody outside a very small circle knew, and which, once it became known, once the circle broke open, as circles eventually do, would change the shape of everything that followed. She had not picked it from a case, had not requested it from the royal collection, had not seen it for the first time the morning of the reception, and decided it complimented her coat. None of that. It had been delivered to her 3 months after the funeral, in a plain envelope. Not plain in the common sense, but plain in the royal sense, which meant no embossing, no crest, deliberately anonymous. There had been a letter. Handwritten, not long. The handwriting was familiar to her in the way that handwriting you have seen for decades on birthday cards, and brief notes, and the occasional more serious correspondence becomes familiar. Not an intimate familiarity, not a warm one, but a real one. the recognition of a specific and individual hand. The letter said, essentially, 3 things. First, that the brooch had been kept separate from the main collection deliberately and for a specific reason. Second, that it was being passed to her now because the time was right and the person who understood its significance had decided she should have it. Third, that wearing it would be understood by those who needed to understand it as an acknowledgement. An acknowledgement of what, precisely, the letter did not say. Camilla had sat with the letter for a long time. She was not a woman given to sentimentality about jewelry. She understood the symbolic weight that jewelry carried in royal life. The communication through objects, the language of accessories that the public half-read and commentators often misread, and the people inside the institution understood completely. She was fluent in that language. She had spent years becoming fluent in it. But this was something else. She read the letter 3 times. She placed a brooch, which had been folded inside a square of black velvet inside the envelope, on the table in front of her. She looked at it for a very long time. Then, she put away. She was not ready. Not yet. The night of the Windsor reception in October, she had been getting dressed, and she had opened the drawer and looked at it again, and something had shifted in her the way a door shifts when the hinges finally accept a change in the wood. She pinned it to her coat. She did not know that a guard in the reception room would see it, and that his face would do the almost nothing it did. She did not know that a sergeant would be watching the guard. She did not know that a junior curator in a museum basement 3 weeks earlier had stopped breathing over a black and white photograph. She did not know that what she had chosen to do, a private act, a quiet acknowledgement, a thing between herself and a woman who was no longer alive to see it, had already begun to move through the institution like a signal sent into deep water, where it would travel silently until it hit something and came back changed. It had already begun. Sophie Reeves had sat on what she found for 4 days before she did anything. She was not passive by nature, but she had spent enough time in proximity to the royal collection to understand what careless movement costs. You did not take a thing like this to a newspaper. You did not post about it. You did not call a friend. You sat with it, and you let your instincts sort themselves into something usable, and then you move carefully and specifically. On the 5th day, she wrote a formal research inquiry to the Royal Collection archivist. She framed it in the careful, neutral language of academic research. She was inquiring, she wrote, about the documentation history of certain pieces catalogued in the mid-20th century records, specifically those which may have been reclassified or administratively modified in the decades following the coronation. She attached the photograph. She referenced the specific catalog notation from her prior work without quoting it directly. She used no language that was speculative or sensational. She was a researcher making a research inquiry. She sent it. Then she sat at her desk and felt the specific cold feeling of having dropped something irreversible into water and watching the rings move outward from the point of impact. The response came in 6 days, which was fast for the Royal Collection. The response was brief and polite and told her absolutely nothing, in the particular way that brief, polite responses from official institutions tell you nothing while confirming everything. The archivist thanked her for her inquiry. He noted that the cataloging of royal jewelry was a complex, ongoing process, and that many items had complex administrative histories. He said her inquiry had been passed to the appropriate office. The appropriate office. Sophie stared at that phrase. She had spent enough years in archival and institutional work to understand what it meant when something was passed to the appropriate office rather than answered. It meant, we see what you are asking. It meant, we are deciding what to do about the fact that you are asking it. It meant the rings in the water had reached a bank. What came next depended on what was on that bank. She did not know it yet, but what was on that bank was considerably more than she had imagined when she sat in her museum basement with a pen hovering over a page and the late Queen laughing in profile in a 1953 photograph, wearing something that was not supposed to exist anymore. The story was already older than anyone currently alive had realized. It had been waiting for exactly this kind of accidental discovery, the kind that does not come from ambition or investigation, but from a junior curator doing her job on a Tuesday in a basement with no idea that the photograph she was cross-referencing was a door that had been standing closed for 7 decades, waiting for someone to simply look directly at it. Sophie had looked. The door was open now, and somewhere across the city, in a reception room at Windsor that smelled of cut flowers and old stone, A guard was standing perfectly still with 19 years of marble on his face, and something moving in his chest that had no name yet but was undeniably starting. The appropriate office turned out to be a room on the third floor of a building adjacent to Buckingham Palace that most people who worked in proximity to the palace had never entered and could not have pointed on a floor plan. It was not secret in the dramatic sense. It was simply one of those rooms that institutions accumulate over centuries. Rooms that exist to handle the things that cannot be handled in the more visible rooms, staffed by people whose job titles appear on no public roster and whose responsibilities are described in no brochure. The woman who ran it was named Margaret Finn. She was 61 years old. She had worked in what she called institutional memory management for 34 years, which was a phrase that sounded administrative and was actually something closer to the opposite of forgetting. Her job, in the most precise terms available, was to know where the bodies were buried. Not literally, in most cases, though there had been 2 exceptions in her career that she thought about on quiet evenings more than she would have preferred, and to ensure that the bodies stayed buried at the appropriate depth for the appropriate duration and were retrieved only when retrieval served the institution rather than threatened it. She was very good at this job. When the archivist's note landed on her desk with Sophie Reeves's research inquiry attached, Margaret Finn read it twice. She set it down. She looked out the window at the gray London sky for approximately 90 seconds. Then she opened a drawer in her desk, the bottom left drawer, the one with the small lock that she kept locked, not because the contents were classified, but because some habits of careful living stick to you after 3 decades, and she removed a thin file. The file was older than Sophie Reeves by nearly 15 years. It was not thick. The things that matter most often take up very little space on paper. She read the file. She already knew what was in it, but she read it again because reading it again was what the situation required. Thorough people reread things they already know. That is part of what makes them thorough. Then, she picked up her phone and made a call. Claire Alderton had been doing her own quiet investigation for 2.5 weeks by the time Margaret Finn's call reached a colleague of Alderton's in a different department. The colleague mentioned it in passing, not because it was intended as a message, but because people who work in connected institutional spaces talk to each other, and some of what they say reaches the ears it was not specifically directed toward. That is also one of the ways institutions work. Not everything moves through official channels. Some things travel through the older, less formal networks, the ones made of coffee conversations and corridor acknowledgments, and the particular way one person's eyes hold another's when a name is mentioned. The name that was mentioned, in this case, was the brooch. Not explicitly. Nobody in these circles said the brooch with the tone of a person naming a significant object. They said something approximate, a piece from the private collection, an item with an unusual history, and the person listening heard the approximate thing and understood what was meant by it, because understanding approximate language is a skill you develop in institutional life, the way you develop any skill through years of practice. Alderton heard the approximate thing on a Wednesday morning, standing in a corridor drinking bad coffee from paper cup, and she heard it and set her cup down on a windowsill and thought for a moment. Then she thought for another moment. Then she went back to her office and took out the note she had written on October 14th. Whitmore, unusual visual response to seize jewelry. And she looked at it and felt the particular satisfaction of a thing confirming itself. She had been right to notice. She was usually right to notice. But being right to notice was only the beginning of a thing, not the end. James Whitmore, during all of this, was doing what James Whitmore did. He was working. He was standing in the places he was assigned to stand. He was watching the things he was assigned to watch. He was carrying his 19 years of professional stillness through the rooms and corridors of royal life with the same deliberate absence of expression that he had carried them through every day for nearly 2 decades. He had not mentioned the brooch to anyone. He thought about it, though, more than he would have expected. There was something about the act of recognition, the specific physical jolt of seeing a thing you associate deeply with one person appearing on another person, that did not resolve cleanly. It sat in the part of his mind that held unresolved things, alongside the 2 sentences he had heard 22 years ago in a corridor, alongside the memory of the velvet pouch. These 3 things had arranged themselves into a shape that was not quite a story yet, but was building toward one. He could feel it building. He was not sure what he would do when it finished building. He was not sure he needed to do anything. Some things build, and then simply sit there architectural rather than explosive, changing the shape of the space without destroying it. He was walking a corridor near the East Wing on a Thursday afternoon when Claire Alderton fell in a step beside him. She did not announce herself. She simply appeared at his elbow, as if she had always been there, and he had simply not noticed until now. "Good afternoon, Sergeant," he said. "Good afternoon, James." She used his first name. She did not always do that. He registered it. "Walk with me." It was not a question. It was not quite an order. It was the specific phrasing of someone who knows you will do what they say because they have positioned the request so that refusal requires more effort than compliance. He kept walking. She kept walking beside him. She did not speak for the length of half a corridor. That was her method. He knew her method. Everyone who worked with her long enough came to know her method because it was consistent and because it worked. She let silence do the opening work. She waited for the other person to fill it or to feel the pressure of not filling it. The pressure was genuine. He felt it. He had 19 years of practice with silence, and he still felt it. "The Windsor reception," she said, eventually. "October 14th. "I remember it," he said, which was accurate and gave nothing. Her Majesty the Queen Consort was wearing a piece of jewelry. She paused. "I noticed your reaction." He considered several responses. He settled on the truest and simplest one. "I recognized it." The corridor was empty in both directions. Their footsteps were the only sound. "From where?" Alderton asked. He thought about the late Queen walking past him in a corridor 22 years ago. The velvet pouch, the low voice, and the two sentences, and what it means when the time comes. "From before," he said. She looked at him from the side. Not a prolonged look, just the quick, assessing kind, the kind that takes a complete reading of a person in less than a second. "Before," she repeated. "Yes." Another half corridor of silence. "Then, would you be willing to put that in writing?" He considered this for longer than the previous consideration. Putting things in writing was a different category of action from speaking. He understood the difference. He had spent 19 years understanding the difference. Speaking could be walked back, misremembered, denied. Writing was a different kind of commitment entirely. "What would it be used for?" he asked. "I don't know yet," she said, which was, he thought, an unusually honest answer. He had expected something more institutional, more reassuring, more calibrated to encourage compliance. The honesty of it was the thing that moved him. "Give me a few days," he said. "You have them," she said. She peeled away at the next intersection, unhurried, as if the conversation had been entirely unremarkable. He continued down the corridor. He had not looked back. Behind him, he heard nothing, which was appropriate because she was very good at departing. He walked for another minute and then stopped at a window and looked out at the courtyard below and thought about what he knew and what it meant and what it always meant to know something inside these walls and carry alone. Sophie Reeves received a phone call on the same Thursday. The caller did not identify herself by name. She identified herself by institution. She was calling from the office of the Royal Collection, and she said she was following up on Sophie's inquiry. Her voice was pleasant and measured in the way that voices are when someone has prepared their pleasant and measured voice before making the call, which Sophie noticed immediately. "We'd like to meet with you," the woman said. "Informally, if possible, to discuss your research." "Informally," Sophie repeated. "Yes, nothing official, just a conversation." Sophie had been in institutional life long enough to know that nothing official, just a conversation was the kind of phrase that meant something almost exactly opposite to its literal content. Things that were nothing official had a way of becoming very official very fast, depending on what you said. And just a conversation was never just a conversation when the person proposing it had been careful enough to present it as such. "Of course," Sophie said. "I'd be glad to." She wrote down the address. It was not the Victoria and Albert. It was not any of the obvious palace-adjacent addresses. It was a private address in Kensington. A house. She looked it up afterward and found it registered to a holding company with no obvious connection to anything, which was itself a kind of connection to things. The meeting was set for the following Monday. She spent the weekend going back through everything she had. The 1953 photograph, her notes from the private cataloging project, the notes she had in her own possession, the one she had written in the ordinary course of her work before she understood the significance of what she was cataloging. She had not surrendered all her notes. She had surrendered everything official, everything requested. But researchers keep working notes. Personal notes, the kind that live in personal notebooks rather than official project files. She had those. She read them over the weekend. Slowly, more carefully than she had read them at the time of writing, because context changes what you see in a page. The brooch appeared in her personal notes 3 times. Once as a physical description, the asymmetric diamond setting, her fascination with the unusual arrangement, her question in the margin about whether the asymmetry was intentional or a result of modification over time. Once as a note about provenance, she had been given partial provenance information, enough to know the piece was very old, pre-Victorian, possibly even older, with a history that moved through several hands before entering the royal collection at a point in the mid-20th century that was not precisely specified. And once, the entry she had nearly forgotten, as a note about the decommissioning notation, which she had flagged at the time with a small question mark, and then left because her job was not to question the notation but to record that it existed. The question mark was still there, small, slightly smudged, as if she had returned to it once before leaving it alone. She was returning to it now. The provenance note was the thing that occupied her most over that weekend. Partial provenance, moving through several hands before entering the royal collection in the mid-20th century. She had not been given enough information to trace the earlier history during the cataloging project, and she had not tried. Now she tried. She had access through her museum work to several databases that were not publicly accessible, and she spent Saturday and Sunday in a systematic, methodical search that she knew was probably futile and did it anyway because that was her nature. Late on Sunday evening, in her flat with a cup of cold tea at her elbow and her laptop casting pale light on her face, she found something. It was not definitive. It was a reference in an obscure estate catalog from 1931, describing a piece of jewelry that matched, in general terms, not specifics, the brooch she had handled. The description was brief. Oval setting, diamond surround, unusual arrangement of stones. The piece had been part of the estate of a Scottish family. The family name was listed. She wrote it down. She looked the family up. She sat very still for a moment. Then she closed her laptop and sat in the dark for a while, thinking about things that fit together the way old pieces fit together. Not neatly, not obviously, but with the particular unmistakable rightness of things that belong to the same story. Margaret Finn, on Sunday evening, was also working. She had spent the week making calls. Not many. The art of what she did was in economy. She contacted only the people who needed to be contacted and said only what needed to be said and nothing extra. Extra was where problems came from. Problems came from excess, from the one additional detail that should have been withheld, from the one conversation that ran 3 minutes longer than it should have. She had spoken to 4 people. 3 of those conversations had been brief and had confirmed things she already expected. The 4th had not been brief and had not confirmed things she expected. The 4th conversation had been with someone she would not name, not even in the quiet of her own mind, not even in notes she intended to shred. She referred to this person in her internal vocabulary as the steward, which was a word that meant a person who keeps something safe on behalf of someone else, someone whose job is not ownership but custody. This was accurate. It described exactly what this person did and had been doing for the past 3 years since the late Queen had died, and the particular arrangement the late Queen had made had moved from active to pending. Pending being the word for when a thing is waiting to be activated by circumstances rather than intention. The circumstances were now active. This was what the steward had told her. Gently but clearly, the circumstances were now active. What had been set in motion was in motion. The brooch being worn was not accidental, not incidental, not a matter of Camilla's personal taste or a random morning impulse. It was deliberate. It was the signal the late Queen had arranged for, years before she died. The acknowledgement she had described in the letter. The activation of something that had been dormant. Margaret Finn had asked one question. Did Camilla know everything, or only enough? The steward had paused before answering. Then, she knows what she needed to know to make the choice. The rest she'll know when it serves her to know it. This was an unsatisfying answer. It was also a completely familiar one. This was how the institution worked. Information moved in segments. People received the portion relevant to their role at the moment it was relevant. Camilla had received her portion. Others would receive theirs. Margaret Finn's job was to manage the movement of segments, to ensure each portion arrived at the right person at the right time, and that no portion arrived prematurely. The problem was Sophie Reeves. Sophie Reeves had arrived at a portion she was not supposed to have. Not because she had done anything wrong, because she was good at her job, and the archive was not perfectly sealed, as archives never are. She had found the photograph through legitimate research. She had connected it to the cataloging work through legitimate professional memory. She had made an inquiry through legitimate academic channels. She was, in every sense, innocent. She was also, in every sense, inside a story she did not yet understand. Margaret Finn's job was now to assess whether Sophie Reeves was a problem to be contained or a coincidence to be managed, and this was the category she always kept open, the one that was most uncomfortable and most often right at development to be used. She did not like the word used. She used it anyway. It was accurate. She thought about it for a long time and reached no firm conclusion by Sunday evening. But she had a meeting arranged for Monday. The meeting would tell her what she needed to know. She was good at reading meetings. She went to bed. She slept 7 hours, which was what she always slept, regardless of what was occupying her thoughts. The occupation of thoughts was her job. She was not going to let her job disturb her sleep. That was the kind of boundary that kept people functional across 3 decades in rooms like hers. The alarm went off at 6. She made coffee. She dressed with the deliberate, economical movements of someone who does not waste time on decisions that could be automated. She looked out her window at the Monday morning street. London in late October. Gray and purposeful. People moving with their heads down, carrying the weight of their particular days. She thought about Sophie Reeves sitting across a table from her in a Kensington house in a few hours. What Sophie would bring. What Sophie would reveal without knowing she was revealing it. What Sophie's face would do when certain things were said. She thought about James Whitmore in his corridor, carrying 22 years of 2 sentences and a velvet pouch. She thought about the brooch, pinned to a coat, catching light in a reception room where a guard noticed, and a sergeant noticed the guard, and the circles in the water had been moving outward ever since. She thought about the late Queen. Briefly. She did not permit herself long thoughts about the late Queen. That was another boundary that functional people in her position maintained. But briefly she thought about her. A woman who had understood, better than almost anyone in her century, that objects carry meaning across time. That a piece of jewelry worn at the right moment by the right person is not decoration. It is a sentence. It is a declaration. It is a door opening. She had set all of this in motion from beyond a death that everyone had thought was simply an ending. It had not been an ending. Monday was coming. The house in Kensington was the kind of house that made no effort to impress you. This was itself impressive. It sat on a quiet residential street behind a painted black door and iron railings, and it looked from the outside exactly like every other house on the street, which was the point because houses that looked like every other house on the street were the kind of houses that drew no attention, and attention was something the people who used this house could not afford to draw. Sophie Reeves stood on the pavement for a moment before ringing the bell. She was wearing her good coat, not the museum coat, the one that had chalk on the sleeve, and a broken second button she kept meaning to fix, but the dark navy one she wore to meetings that felt important. She had spent a moment that morning wondering if wearing the good coat was too obvious, and then she had worn it anyway because the alternative was the chalk coat, and no. She rang the bell. The door was answered by a young man who was so thoroughly nondescript that afterward she would struggle to describe him. Medium height, neutral expression, a general impression of competence that left no particular details behind. He showed her into a sitting room at the front of the house. The room was comfortable in a professional way. Good furniture arranged to facilitate conversation rather than relaxation. A table with water and 2 glasses on it. Light from the window, falling across a space that had been arranged so that both people sitting in it would be equally visible to each other. She recognized the arrangement. Interrogation rooms and diplomatic reception rooms shared a similar principle. Position people so that reading faces is easy for everyone. The advantage, such as it was, belonged to whoever was less nervous. She sat down. She was nervous. She had decided before coming that she would not pretend not to be nervous, because people who pretend not to be nervous read as less trustworthy than people who are visibly calm in their nervousness. There was a difference between composure and performance. She was aiming for composure. Margaret Finn came in 3 minutes later. She was not what Sophie had expected, and Sophie, in the days following, would struggle to articulate what she had expected versus what she got. Margaret Finn was 61 years old and looked it, which was to say she looked completely at ease with time in a way that some people achieve and most do not. She was wearing a dark suit and no jewelry, which Sophie noticed and which struck her later as meaningful given everything. She had the handshake of someone who had given 10,000 handshakes, and was giving this one with the same quality of attention as all the others, full, brief, decisive. "Thank you for coming," she said. "Thank you for the invitation," Sophie said. They sat. Margaret Finn poured water for both of them. Small practical domestic acts. Settling. "Tell me about your research," Margaret Finn said. "Not your inquiry. Your research. Broader." An invitation to speak at length, rather than a prompt for a specific answer. Sophie recognized this too. She was being given room to reveal herself before the specific questions began. She told her about the photograph, the 1953 reception, the late queen in profile, the brooch with the asymmetric diamond setting. She was concise. She gave facts rather than interpretations. She watched Margaret Finn's face while she spoke, looking for the things that faces do when information lands that was expected versus unexpected, and she found nothing, which told her that everything she was saying was already known. When she finished, Margaret Finn said, "And the cataloging project." "Not a question." "Yes," Sophie said. "You handled the piece." "Yes." "For approximately an hour under magnification. It's a distinctive setting. The asymmetric arrangement of the diamonds is unusual enough that I remembered it specifically. And the notation." "Decommissioned," Sophie said. She said it without inflection, the way you say a word you are quoting rather than using. I noted it at the time because it was unusual in the context of a piece with that kind of age and history. But my role in the project was to catalog, not to interpret, so I recorded it and moved on. Until the photograph. Until the photograph, she agreed. Margaret Finn looked at her for a moment in the way that certain people look at you when they have decided something but have not yet said it aloud, as if they are confirming the decision in the act of looking. Then, she said, "What do you think decommission meant?" Sophie had prepared for this question. She had thought about it all weekend. She had decided on her answer before she walked in the door, and she was going to give it fully rather than partially, because partial answers in situations like this were a form of positioning, and positioning was a game she would lose against a woman like this, and she knew it. "I don't think it meant destroyed," she said. "If a piece of that age and significance had been broken down for stones, there would be a record. Not a public one, necessarily, but a record within the collection. What decommission means, in the context I encountered it, is that the piece was removed from any accessible documentation. Officially, it stopped existing, but officially and actually are different things. The piece exists. I held it, and the notation wasn't a record of destruction, it was a record of removal from record." Margaret Finn said nothing for a moment. Then, "That's a very precise interpretation." "I'm a cataloger," Sophie said. "Precision is the job." Something shifted in Margaret Finn's face. Not a smile, exactly, it was too small for that. But a relaxation, a fraction of the professional composure releasing, the way a held breath releases. "The piece has a history," Margaret Finn said. "A long one. Longer than most people who have ever handled it have known." "The estate catalogue," Sophie said. 1931, the Scottish family." A pause. "You found that." "Sunday evening." Margaret Finn looked at her for another moment. Then she reached into the bag beside her chair and removed a thin file and set it on the table between them. She did not open it. She rested her hand on it lightly, the way you rest your hand on a thing you are about to give someone. "I'm going to tell you some things," she said, "and I need to understand, before I do, what your intentions are. Not your professional intentions, your personal ones." Sophie looked at the file. "I'm not a journalist," she said. "I have no interest in taking this somewhere public. I found something unusual in the course of legitimate research, and I wanted to understand what I found. That's all. That's all." Margaret Finn repeated. "Yes." Another pause. Longer this time. "All right," Margaret Finn said. She opened the file. The history of the brooch, as Margaret Finn told it that Monday morning in the Kensington sitting room, was not a single story. It was 4 stories nested inside each other, moving backward through time the way Russian dolls move when you open them, each one containing another, smaller and older, until you reach the center. The outermost story was the one Sophie already knew. The late queen, the private collection, the decommissioning notation, the decision, made years before her death, to place the brooch in a specific configuration for a specific future. The second story was the one in a 1953 photograph. Sophie had assumed the photograph showed the brooch being worn routinely. It was not routine. The 1953 reception had been significant in a way that the official record did not capture. It had been a meeting, not officially documented as such, between the late queen and A woman named in Margaret Fenn's file, whose name Sophie recognized with a jolt because the name was attached to a period of royal history that was well documented in public records as a source of considerable institutional tension. A woman who had been positioned, briefly, in a complicated relation to the crown. A woman whose relationship with the late queen had been characterized publicly as one thing and was, according to what Margaret Fenn was now saying, something more privately nuanced. The brooch had been worn at that meeting deliberately, as a signal then as now, as a statement of something that had no official language. The third story was the Scottish family and the 1931 estate catalog. The family name that Sophie had looked up Sunday evening and recognized. Margaret Fenn confirmed what Sophie had suspected. The family had a connection to the royal household that predated the late Queen's reign and was not part of any public history. The brooch had passed from that family to the royal collection as part of an arrangement that was private and personal rather than official. It had entered not through purchase or gift in a formal sense, but through a kind of custody, the family giving the crown something they had kept safe and the crown agreeing to continue keeping it safe. The fourth story, the innermost one, was older than any of the others. Margaret Fenn said it was older than the file. She said the file contained only what had been documented in the 20th century. What lay before that, she said, was more uncertain, more fragmentary, reconstructed from partial records, and informed inference rather than documentation. She did not detail it extensively. She outlined it. She said that the brooch had moved through Scottish noble history for at least 3 centuries before the 1931 estate, and that its movement had always been connected to a particular kind of trust. Not financial, not political, but personal. The passing of it between people had always been an act of one person saying to another, "I'm telling you something in this object that I cannot say any other way." Sophie sat in the good coat and listened and felt the weight of the morning settling on her the way weight settles when you have been carrying something and finally understood what it is. "Why are you telling me this?" she asked. Margaret Fenn looked at her. "Because you found the photograph," she said, "and because you were in the cataloging project. And because the timing of both things, relative to what is currently unfolding, is not something I can simply manage around. You are inside the story already. The choice I have is whether you are inside it with information or without it. Inside it with information is less dangerous," Sophie said. "Not a question." "Considerably," Margaret Fenn said. "And what do you need from me?" Margaret Fenn closed the file. She set it to one side. She folded her hands in her lap with the practiced ease of a woman who had spent 34 years making her hands do unrevealing things. "Nothing yet," she said. "But I suspect something, eventually. When I know what, I'll be in touch." Sophie left the house in Kensington 40 minutes after she had entered it. She walked to the end of the street and stood on the corner for a moment in the gray October air. The city moved around her with complete indifference. Buses, people, a cyclist, a dog. The ordinary immense machinery of city, not knowing or caring about sitting rooms and files and brooches and for stories nested inside each other like dolls. She thought about the late queen in profile in a 1953 photograph, laughing at something off camera, wearing something that was not decoration, but language. She started walking. James Whitmore put his account in writing on Thursday. He had spent the days since his conversation with Claire Alderton thinking about it carefully, the way he thought about most things, slowly, from multiple directions, giving the consideration room to develop before he acted on it. He was not a person who rushed decisions. He had a wife who said this about him with a mix of affection and exasperation that he had come to understand as simply the texture of their particular marriage. He took his time. Usually the time was well spent. He wrote 3 paragraphs. He was specific. He wrote about the night in Windsor when he had been 26, the late queen in the corridor, the velvet pouch, the 2 sentences. He described the sentences exactly, as he remembered them, including the specific phrasing that had stayed with him for 22 years. It was always meant to come back. Make sure she understands what it means when the time comes. He wrote about the October 14th reception and the recognition. What he had seen, where he had seen it. His certainty. He did not interpret. He described. He was a witness, not an analyst. His job was to say what he had seen and heard. The interpretation was someone else's work. He gave the account to Alderton on Friday morning. She read it in front of him, standing in a corridor, which was the way she seemed to prefer to do things. On her feet, in motion, as if being stationary made her vulnerable to something. She read it twice. She folded it with the same compact precision she brought to everything. "This confirms something important," she said. "What?" he asked. She looked at him. "That it was always planned," she said. "Not a recent decision. Not Camilla choosing to wear something she found appealing. A thing the late queen set in motion years before she died, and arranged to complete after she was gone." He thought about that. About a woman who had spent 70 years on a throne, understanding how to move pieces forward in time, past her own life, into a future she would not see. "Do you know why?" he asked. "I'm starting to," Alderton said. She put the folded account in her inside jacket pocket. She looked at him for a moment with the appraising, honest look that he had come to understand was her version of gratitude. "Thank you, James," she said, "for carrying this as long as you did." He did not know exactly what she meant by that. He thought he understood the approximate shape of it. He had been carrying something that belonged to a larger story. The carrying was done now. Someone else had it. He felt the thing in his chest that had moved since October 14th settle slightly, the way things settle when they have found the level they belong at. He went back to his posting. He stood. He watched. He was still. Somewhere in the palace that same Friday, in a room that smelled of fresh flowers and old wood, Camilla was having a conversation with someone she trusted completely. She was sitting with her hands in her lap in a high-backed chair. The brooch was not on her coat today. It was in a small dish on the table beside her, where she had placed it when she came in, because she had a habit of removing jewelry when she sat in this particular chair, in this particular room, for this particular kind of conversation. It was a private room. The conversations she had in it were private. She was talking about the letter. She was talking about the night she had decided to wear the brooch and what she had felt doing it. She was talking about the late queen in the careful, loving, complicated way that people talk about someone they're still in the process of understanding after that person is gone, finding new dimensions, new meanings, new evidence of intentions that had not been visible before. The person she was talking to listened without interrupting. That was their particular gift. They had the quality of receptive stillness that is rarer than eloquence. They knew how to receive what was being said without managing it, without rushing to interpretation. They simply held it. At a certain point, Camilla said, "She planned it for a long time. Longer than I knew. She knew what it would mean when people saw it, and she knew who would see it, and she knew what would happen." She looked at the brooch in the small dish. The pale central stone. The asymmetric stars of diamonds, arranged like a constellation rather than a crown. "She trusted me with something very old," she said. "Something that's been carried by a lot of people across a very long time. And I think she wanted people to understand that what's between two women doesn't have to be what the public imagines it was. It can be something quieter, something that gets passed forward instead of buried." The room was quiet. "Did you know?" the other person asked. "About its full history." "Not all of it," Camilla said. "I'm learning." She looked at the brooch for another moment. Then she picked it up and pinned it back to her lapel. Not because she was going anywhere, not because she was being seen, but because it seemed right to wear it in a room where the conversation deserved it. Outside the window, London was doing what London did. Enormous, indifferent, continuous. Inside the room, something that had been moving across 3 centuries was still moving. Quietly, deliberately, in the direction it had always been heading.